We're getting to the end of the Old Testament in our daily Bible reading. And so at this point in Israel's history and Judah's history, Solomon has died. And after Solomon's death, they divide into two separate countries. You have the northern kingdom that we call Israel, and the southern kingdom is often called Judah. And that southern kingdom, Judah, was led by members of David's family, by David's descendants, and there were some good kings in the nation of Judah. But the same could not be said of Israel. Israel, that northern kingdom, had zero good kings. Every king that the northern kingdom had was an utter failure from a spiritual standpoint. They were wicked. They were sinful. Not only that, a lot of those kings that they had in the northern kingdom were guys that you wouldn't want to work for. They were guys that fathers of daughters would not want their daughter bringing home one day. They're just guys you don't want to be around. They're just bad people on so many levels. And so by the time we get to 2 Kings 17, which was part of our daily Bible reading recently, we're in the final dynasty of the northern kingdom. And the northern kingdom had a lot of turmoil. Not only did the overall nation, the people of God, divide into two separate nations, that northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, had several dynasties, several assassination attempts. It was complete and total chaos in the northern kingdom. And so by 2 Kings 17, we are in that final dynasty. The end is coming. Israel is about to fall. And if you have been following along in our daily Bible reading, then you probably saw the end coming a mile away. You see, God has sent prophet after prophet after prophet after prophet to call Israel, to beg Israel to repent before it's too late. He's telling Israel all the time, look, if you don't get your act together, I'm going to have to send some judgment. But their kings were evil. The people were evil. Sin was everywhere. Idolatry was everywhere. To be honest, it's not a time, it's not a place that any of us would want to raise our kids or our grandkids. It was not a pleasant time to be a member of the northern kingdom, for that matter, either. You see there in 2 Kings 17, the king of Assyria is knocking at the front door. In fact, when you read the first 6 verses of 2 Kings 17, he's all over the place. In 6 verses, he's mentioned 6 times. He dominates the first part of the chapter with good reason, because he's about to destroy Israel. In fact, everything in the first 6 verses of 2 Kings 17 tells us that something bad is about to happen. It's like we're watching our favorite TV show or our favorite movie, and the lights get real dim, and the music gets really, really dramatic. I would hum it, but it would be off key, and my son would start humming it too, and that would cause some issues. But it's like that, where you read it and you see it, and everything you're seeing as you're reading this story tells you that something bad is about to happen. That's what we see in 2 Kings 17. And on the other end, we see Israel's king. And his name is Hoshea. He's king of Israel. His name means salvation. That's what his name means on paper. But the reality is that his life and his legacy and his memory is anything but salvation. It's the opposite. It's destruction. And so from the very beginning of the story here in 2 Kings 17, everyone in Israel, everyone who's been reading 2 Kings 17 or 2 Kings knows that Israel's about to fall. You know how the story is about to end. It's more cliche than a Hallmark movie. The Assyrians are there. They're at the front door, and they are about to take the children of Israel into captivity. And if you're a child of God, if you're a citizen in that northern kingdom, you're looking out your front door, you're looking out your window one day, and you see the Assyrian army. And you know what that means. It's hard to understate how cruel the Assyrian army was. Of all the ancient armies, an argument can be made that the Assyrians were the most cruel. And so if you have a kid who's a little young, maybe a little can't handle some blood and guts, I'll just explain, just cover their ears real quick. I just can't help but to talk about that for a second. The Assyrians were so brutal that when they captured you, they skinned you. They hung your skin around their city. They would cut off your tongues. They would pierce. They were super cruel. And not only that, when you read the Assyrian text that they have left behind for us, that archaeologists have dug up in the Middle East, they're bragging about it. They're boasting about, look how cruel they were. You see, the Assyrians wanted the entire ancient Near East to know when they showed up, something bad's about to happen. You were about to fall. You were about to be destroyed. It was a form of ancient psychological warfare. They were cruel. And so when you look out your front door in ancient Israel and you see the Assyrian flags and the Assyrian armies, you're absolutely terrified because you know what that means. You know you're about to die. You know you're about to endure some pain and some suffering. You know there's a good possibility you may be skinned alive. You may be impaled. You may face some unimaginable torture. That's what's about to happen. And to make matters worse, when he shows up on the scene, he's not happy. He's not there to share a cup of coffee with King Hoshea. He is there angry. He's there to destroy Israel because Hoshea was supposed to send the king of Assyria money every year. And the king of Israel said, you know what, I'm tired of doing that. I'm going to make an alliance with Egypt because Egypt's going to come to my aid and we're going to stand up to evil Assyria. Well, the king of Assyria, as you can imagine, wasn't too happy about that. So now he's standing at the front door, ready to do something about it there in 2 Kings chapter 17. That's where we are. The king has had enough. He's been betrayed, and he's there to wipe Israel off the face of the map. And so he besieges Samaria, the capital city of that northern kingdom. And that siege lasts for 3 years. For 3 years, you look out your front door and you see the Assyrian army. For 3 years, you're wondering where your next food is coming from because the Assyrians have surrounded the city. There's no going in and there's no going out. You're wondering where your meal is coming from. You're wondering where your water is coming from. You're wondering about every part of your life as you look out the front door for 3 long years, wondering when is this going to end? It became more or less, as we would call it today, a war of attrition. And eventually, as the text tells us, Samaria falls, Israel falls, and the northern kingdom is deported. They're taking elsewhere, and we'll talk about that more in a second. But it's here in 2 Kings 17 that we see 3 basic reasons why nations fall. As the writer of 2 Kings looks back on Israel's history as a nation, he summarizes it by reminding us of 3 reasons nations fall. I don't want to spoil the surprise too much, but it really boils down to one simple reason if you really think about it. Nations fall because of sin. And I think that makes it real for us today. Because we can look at our front door and we can see the sin that surrounds us. But even though this may be one of those texts that we are unfamiliar with, I think it has a lot to teach us even today, even some 3,700 years later. So let's just jump into the text there in 2 Kings chapter 17 and verse 6, where it reads, "In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria. He deported the Israelites to Assyria and settled them in Halah, along the Habor, Gozan's river, in the cities of the Medes." So the very first thing we see there, as we mentioned a moment ago, is the deportation of the Israelites. That was the Assyrian practice. That when they conquered you, you did not get to stay in your homeland. You did not get to stay in your hometown. You were taken elsewhere. It would be like if, let's say, the Russians conquered the U.S., if they conquered all of the Americans, and they took all Americans to Brazil, and all the Brazilians they sent to America. That's kind of what's going on in the ancient Near East under Assyria. The Assyrian thinking on that was that if you were away from your home and away from your family and away from the land that you know well, you were less likely to revolt. That's what's going on through their mind. And so the entire nation of Israel has been deported, and there in verse 7 it tells us why. This disaster happened because the people of Israel sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt from the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and because they worshiped other gods. Now, verse 7 is going to be repeated in many different ways throughout this chapter. Those images, those ideas are going to be seen over and over again. There in verse 8, we see immediately after how they sinned against the Lord. There in verse 8, they lived according to the customs of the nations that the Lord had dispossessed before the Israelites, and according to what the kings of Israel did. According to the nations that Israel dispossessed. That they could look back, and the writer looks back at all those nations, like the Canaanites and the Perizzites and all those nations with the funny ite names that we read about in like Joshua. The nations that Israel conquered, and the writer tells us there in the text that they're repeating the same sins. They're going down the same path in many ways. And the Israelites, verse 9, secretly did things against the Lord their God. Well, apparently it's not so secret, because we read about it 2,700 years later, that were not right. They built high places in all the towns, from watchtower to fortified city. They set up themselves sacred pillars and Asherah poles. That's places for idol worship on every high hill and under every green tree. They burned incense there on all the high places, just like the nations that the Lord had, once again, driven out before them had done. They did evil things, angering the Lord. Once again, they served idols, although the Lord had told them, you must not do this. Is it repetitive enough for you yet? Israel serving idols, they're ignoring God. They're repeating the history of the nations before them. Still, there in verse 13, the Lord warned Israel and Judah through every prophet and every seer, saying, turn from your evil ways and keep my commands and statutes according to the whole law I commanded your ancestors and sent to you through my servants, the prophets. But they would not listen. Instead, they became obstinate or stubborn or hard-headed like their ancestors who did not believe the Lord their God. They rejected his statutes and his covenant he had made with their ancestors and the warnings he had given them. They followed worthless things and became worthless themselves. Following, once again, the surrounding nations, the Lord had commanded them not to imitate. They abandoned all the commands of the Lord their God. They made cast images for themselves, 2 calves and an Asherah pole. They bowed in worship to all the stars of the sky and served Baal. And then look at verse 17. Parents, just hone in on verse 17. They sacrificed their sons and daughters in the fire. Parents, can you imagine putting your kid on an altar and burning your child potentially alive to worship your God? That's what they were doing there in Israel. And they practiced, it tells us, divination and interpreted omens. They devoted themselves to do what was evil in the Lord's sight and angered him. Therefore, the Lord was very angry with Israel, and he removed them from his presence only the tribe of Judah remained. But even Judah, verse 19, did not keep the commands of the Lord their God, but lived according to the customs that Israel had practiced. So the Lord rejected all the descendants of Israel, punished them, and handed them over to plunderers until he had banished them from his presence. And when the Lord tore Israel from the house of David, Israel made Jeroboam, son of Nebat, king. Then Jeroboam led Israel away from following the Lord and caused them to commit grave sin. The Israelites persisted in all the sins of Jeroboam and committed that all the sins of Jeroboam that Jeroboam committed and did not turn away from them. Finally, verse 23, the Lord removed Israel from his presence, just as he had declared through all his servants, the prophets. And so Israel has been exiled to Assyria from their homeland to this very day. There's one big thing that kept coming up there in the text as I read it, at least as I was thinking about it all week, and that's sin. Sin is all over this text. It's like a flashing neon light on the side of the road here in the text. Every time we turn around there in 2 Kings chapter 17, we read of Israel's sin and Israel's rebellion. Israel did not fall because Hoshea and his predecessors made some bad political moves. They did not fall because they went into some kind of economic recession. They did not fall for any other geopolitical reason. Israel fell because of sin. And when we read the story in the account and the reason why Israel fell there in 2 Kings 17, Israel's rebellion before God dominates the entire chapter. Yet in a chapter that is dominated by Israel's rebellion, that describes it in very vivid and sometimes even some very graphic terms, the text also tells us three things God did. Three things. There in verse 7, it tells us why Israel was destroyed, that they were destroyed because of their sin. They were destroyed because they were ungrateful. That even though God had redeemed them from captivity, they turned against God. They didn't care. They worshiped other gods. That God's amazing grace was responded to with amazing apostasy. And so in many ways, it reads like a sequel to the book of Judges. The book of Judges where Israel spirals out of control and spirals into this great immoral society. That's what you see when you read 2 Kings 17. Israel spiraling out of control. That's what happened when they rejected God's redemption. They start building there in the text high places everywhere. It says they're doing it in secret, but we know about it 2,700 years later, so it wasn't a big secret. The text tells us they're building high places and altars and temples and places of worship to all these false gods in every town and in every fortified city and in every watchtower and on every hill and under every tree. Yeah, they might have been offering up some worship to the one true God, but they were still worshiping the false gods. They were idolaters. They were looking out, and if they could find a way to build an altar to a false god someplace, they were building an altar to the false god, just like the nations had done before them. The nations that lived in Canaan before Israel had influenced Israel to the point that they pulled them away from God. But that wasn't God's design. That wasn't what God wanted his people to do. God wanted his people to be holy, to be different, to be distinct. But Israel's history, Israel's story, doesn't follow their divine call. And sometimes that's the same way for us today. That even though, much like Israel, you and I have been called out of darkness into his marvelous light, how many times in our life do we run straight back to sin? how many times do we run to the idols of this world? How many times do we act just like Israel? You see, the great sin of Israel that we see described here in the text, that great sin of idolatry, isn't just limited to pagan temples. Idolatry really starts in the heart. It starts when we start looking anywhere and everywhere for fulfillment in anything other than God. And the very root cause of all of our struggles with sin is an idol. That all of the struggles that we may have today with sins are really deep down just worship problems. That our focus isn't really on God, it's on money and power and pleasures and hobbies. Those are the things, those are the idols that pull us away from God. Those are the reasons that we struggle with sin. You see, when we start serving the wrong God, that is hobbies and pleasures and money and power, we start living the wrong lifestyle. Rather than being transformed in the image of God, we start living like the nation and the world around us. So much so that if you were to read 2 Kings 17, alongside the history of the ancient Canaanites, they look about the same. Both are serving idols. Both are offering their children up on sacrifices. Everywhere you turn, there's idols. That's what you see. That the children of Israel are worshiping the exact same idols in the exact same way for the exact same reasons. Israel's not so secret affair with the idols and the nations was ultimately a rejection of God's redeeming love. That even though God loved Israel, God cared for Israel, God had redeemed Israel, they turned away from him. Amazing grace in the story of Israel should have been responded to with lasting gratitude. But it wasn't the case. Instead, God's amazing grace was followed by ingratitude and rebellion. We say oftentimes, I've been redeemed. We sing that song from time to time. But sometimes our life is a life of constant rebellion before God. And that's what Israel did themselves. And so one of the things we learn here in the very first chapters of the story of Israel is that they forgot God's redemption. That yes, nations fall because of sin, but at the root of all their sin is a forgetting of God's redemption, which is why taking moments every Sunday morning to remember the death of our Savior is so important, because it brings our mind back to the cost of our redemption and the gratitude we must feel and must have for our Lord, the fact that he bled and died for us. The first step in destroying a nation is forgetting God's redemption. Because when we do that, we sin. And sin and rebellion has consequences for everyone. Not just Israel, but for every person. But God is a God of grace. God is patient. God is kind. He doesn't want to destroy his people. And there in 2 Samuel 17, he tells the people there in verse 13, he sends these prophets to call them to turn away from their evil ways, to keep his commands, to come back to him. But the people didn't listen. They acted just like their ancestors in the wilderness that we read about in Exodus and Numbers and Deuteronomy and Leviticus, those rebellious ancestors. They didn't believe God. And since they didn't believe God and they weren't listening to God, there was no way they were going to obey God. And so that one of the great sins of Israel that we see here in 2 Kings 17 is a refusal to believe God. And that's the same struggle that our society faces today. That sometimes because we don't believe God, we ignore what God has to say. And as a result, God judges us. And even though God sent prophet after prophet after prophet there to warn Israel, to call Israel to come back to him, Israel didn't listen. Instead, it tells us that they rejected his statutes. They turned away from him. And there in the text, there in verse 15, it tells us that they followed worthless idols and became worthless themselves. There's a reason that statement is true. There's a reason the writer of 2 Kings leads off with that statement. And that's because they ignored God's warning. But not just that, that statement is true because of what we read there in Psalm 115 and verse 8. That those who make them, that's idols, are just like them, that's idols, as all who trust in them. What we worship changes us. God isn't surprised by that. God knows that. God understands that we become what we worship, which is why the God always warns us about the dangers of idolatry. And the New Testament isn't any different. The New Testament is always warning us to stay away from idols, to keep our focus on God. Just look at the book of Hebrews. Because the book of Hebrews is telling us constantly that Israel's story, Israel's apostasy, can be our story too if we keep ignoring God's warnings. And so the great tragedy of Israel's fall is that God gave them warning after warning after warning, going all the way back to the very beginning of their history as a nation in Deuteronomy. God told them what would happen if they turned away, but they didn't listen. And even though God sent those prophets, they ignored them. They ignored all those warnings, and so they fell because of that. So Israel forgot God's redemption. They ignored God's warnings, but not just that. The text describes how God judged them there in verse 18. That God removed them from the land and from his presence. He rejected them. And once again, it tells us in verse 23, he removed Israel from his presence. None of that sounds good. None of that sounds pleasant. Sin has consequences. Sin drives us away from God's presence. And it's been that way from the beginning. Think back to the Garden of Eden. When Adam and Eve are in the Garden of Eden and they're sinning against God, what ends up happening? They're banished. And when Cain sins and murders his brother, what happens? He's banished. Sin always leads us further and further away from God. Sin separates us from God. And the journey away from God there in the text began with Jeroboam there in 2 Kings chapter 17 and verse 21 and 22. It describes how it began when Jeroboam led them away from God. That Israel's destruction, Israel's story began with the king. The leader who was tasked with pointing the people to God. The leader who was tasked with showing them godliness from his throne is the one who leads them further and further away. That his desire to worship the gods of this world influenced the people, and his influence spread. But it didn't stop at the border of Israel. It went beyond, and even Judah, verse 19, it tells us, started worshiping those idols too. And now, as the story begins to wrap up and come to a close there in the text, God is telling them that you are about to experience God's wrath. So sin spreads. The sin of Jeroboam was not isolated to his life. It spread to Israel, the nation, and even to Judah. And so already there's a subtle hint here in 2 Kings 17 that Judah will suffer the same fate because the consequences of sin also spread. That anyone who sins will face God's wrath. So what we begin to see here in 2 Kings 17 is that a nation falls not because of politics or a military or an economy. The primary reason that a nation falls is religious and theological. That Israel had sinned. Israel had chosen to worship idols. And so the example of Israel becomes an example for us today. that nations fall because of sin. And for thousands of years, nation after nation after nation has made the decision to turn away from God, and they've all fallen. And they've all fallen for the exact same reason. But it doesn't have to be this way. We can make the decision to serve God. And so really, the choice that's before us even tonight is that we can make the decision to serve God and enjoy the blessings of a relationship with God, or we can turn away and experience God's wrath. That's the choice that's before us today. What's your choice? What's your decision? If we can help you with anything, please let us know. While together we stand and sing.